Hello, and welcome to Nothing Ever Happens in Canada, but we know this is simply not true. This is a Canadian podcast about the myths, legends, and just good old stories Canada has to tell. I'm Canadian Girl. Thanks so much for joining me today on this very important adventure. With everything going on in the world right now, I thought what better time than now than to look at some of Canada's medical heroes from our history who have paved the way for the heroes who are courageously fighting on the front lines every day. This show is dedicated to all the very brave and hard-working frontline staff across our country. We all thank you from the bottom of our hearts across Canada. On today's adventure, through the hospital halls and doctors' offices of Canada, we will meet the first woman known to have practiced nursing skills, and she lived over 400 years ago. Stop by Canada's very first hospital, and it's probably not where you think it is. We'll meet a nursing sister who was so concerned with how her hospitals would be built she was known to sleep on the construction grounds just to oversee the work being done. A lovely doctor who retired at the young age of 95 and ran an illegal birth control clinic for 30 years. A doctor who discovered something so important to medicine, he was sent to the moon, kind of. A hero from the 1918 pandemic who isn't as celebrated as he should be for saving so many lives. And we'll meet a doctor who was actually sent to the moon. The first medical hero on our adventure today is Mrs. Marie Rolette Hebert Hubu. I hope I said that correctly. She is credited with being the first person in Canada to practice nursing. Born in Paris, France, in 1580, she received her education from a convent run by nuns. She could read and write, which was almost unheard of in the 16th century for a woman. Marie was the wife of Louis Hebert. He was an apothecary. I hope I said that right. Which, at the time, basically meant he was a doctor in today's terms. He was a surgeon and known to make medicine that he sold to others. Her husband worked closely with Samuel de Champlain on his many expeditions, which allowed the couple to hop on the next ship out and head to the newly founded Quebec they had heard so much about. The husband and wife team would arrive in Quebec in 1617 from Paris, France. They would care for the early settlers of Quebec from 1617 to 1649. The couple had a strong interest in caring for and learning from the indigenous people of the land. Marie herself was very interested in the indigenous ways of healing and would consult with the locals on many occasions trying to learn their ways. Maria was always right by her husband's side, assisting as any nurse would today as he saw each patient. She is known to be the first European woman to have settled in Quebec, and she is also credited as being Canada's very first teacher. She was known to teach the children in the community how to read and write. Marie Rolette Hebert Hubu, we are so honored you decided to make Canada your home. And thank you for your numerous contributions in the early days when Quebec was just getting settled. Your medical skills and teaching skills will never be forgotten. You are our first medical hero today on our adventure, and we are grateful for your services. Just a couple more stops before we leave Quebec. One pit stop for us has been located in Montreal since 1645, Hotel Dieu. Again, I hope I said this right. When translated to English, it means Hotel of God. The first hospital in Canada would be established by Jean Anne Mance. She did this before the famous Grey Nuns did, and is credited as being the first nurse to settle in New France, which was the Quebec area at the time. She would open the doors of the first hospital on October 8, 1645. Though today it is a museum, it was once a hospital where the world's first kidney removal took place in 1868. The first femur transplant was done in 1959. The world's first successful recovery of a patient with burns to 90% of their body in 1981. In 1993, they would perform the world's first robotic-assisted laparoscopic surgery. I hope I said that close to right. The famous Grey Nuns would arrive in Canada around 1737. They were a group of nursing sisters who began using religion and medicine to heal the sick. They would begin to build hospitals across Canada, the first in Bytown in 1845, which is Ottawa today. The next required a group of nuns to hop in a canoe to find the perfect location in the Red River Colony area to build their next hospital in 1855. Today, this is the Manitoba and North Dakota border area. And they continued to build more across the country. The Grey Nun nursing sisters would need a whole episode for themselves to share their story. I will tell you about a nursing sister named Martha Joseph, who was born in 1823 in Quebec. At an early age, she would learn carpentry skills from her father, which helped her develop a love of architecture and design when she was older. She is credited with building 24 hospitals that were really more like healthcare centers across the Pacific Northwest. She was also known to keep a very close eye on her buildings during the construction phase by living in the smallest shack on site just so she could oversee her beloved building and make any small changes that were needed. Our next hero on our adventure today is Dr. Emily Stowe. Many of you may have heard of her before, but in case you haven't, or you may have forgot, let me tell you a little bit about our first female to practice medicine in Canada. Born May 1st, 1883 in the Norwich County Township in Ontario, young Emily would begin her career as a teacher. She would teach at local schools for 7 years. Then she struggled between jobs as she tried to upgrade her teaching career. She kept coming up against the same obstacle. She was being denied because she was a woman. Until in 1854, when she was hired in Brantford, Ontario at the public school to be the principal. She would become the first female principal of a public school in Upper Canada. She taught for 2 years until she was married and then left to start her family. Sadly, her husband would develop tuberculosis, and on top of being a mother, this would push Emily to want to become a doctor. She would be denied entrance to the Toronto School of Medicine in 1865 and was personally told by the VP at the time the doors were not open to women and would probably never open that way anytime soon. Unable to achieve her goals in Canada, she went to the New York Medical College for Women in 1867. That same year, she would move back to Canada and open up her medical practice in Toronto on Richmond Street, making her the first female to practice medicine in Canada, as her doctor or medical degree from the U.S. was not recognized at this time. She remained a fighter for women's rights her whole entire life. Dr. Emily Stowe was finally granted her license to practice medicine by the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario on July 16, 1880, 13 years later after she achieved it in New York. This made her the second woman to be licensed as a doctor in Canada at the time. A fun fact to add, after all her hard work for women's rights in the medical community, I bet she could not have been prouder when her daughter, Augusta Stowe Gullen, was the first woman to earn her medical degree in Canada. The Emily Stowe Public School can be found in Norwich Township, Ontario, as well as there is another one in Courtice, Ontario, and a women's shelter in Toronto named after the beloved doctor. To Dr. Emily Stowe and Dr. Augusta Stowe Gullen, not only are you two amazing women medical heroes here in Canada, you are also heroes when it comes to defending and standing up for women's rights. We are all so grateful, inspired, and proud of both of you. The St. Catharines General and Marine Hospital in Ontario was the first training hospital for nurses in 1874. Today, thanks to so many training hospitals like this one, we have over 265,000 registered hero nurses providing care across the country. Our next medical hero today is one of my favorites. Meet Dr. Elizabeth Catherine Bagshaw. Born October 19, 1881 in Canning, Ontario, which is just south of Orillia on the east side of Lake Simcoe. In 1905, she would graduate from the University of Toronto. Dr. Elizabeth Bagshaw would then start her practice in Hamilton, Ontario. She was known for quite some time as the baby doctor, delivering thousands of babies. It is even said she signed the most birth certificates for 3 years in a row in the 1920s. Dr. Bagshaw also worked for 10 years at the dermatology clinic at the hospital for no pay. Her biggest achievement was in 1932 when she was involved in the first illegal birth control clinic. She believed it was not good for the country for one to have a child they could not afford. Dr. Bagshaw would provide education to women and was the first to shout out that women have the right to be in control of their reproductive system, not anyone else. She would be the medical director of the birth control clinic for 30 years. In 1969, the clinic Dr. Bagshaw had fought so hard to protect finally became legal. She's a pretty badass lady, I know, right? It gets even better, trust me. Dr. Bagshaw would run her family medical practice for 70 years in Hamilton, Ontario, when she finally decided to retire in 1976 at the young age of 95 years old. At the time, she even still had 50 regular patients. She was the oldest working doctor in Canada at the time and was able to enjoy a whole 5 years of her well-deserved retirement. She lived to see 100 years old, celebrating her big day in October 1981. She would pass away just shortly after this in the new year. There is an Elizabeth Bagshaw Elementary School in Hamilton, Ontario, and a women's clinic in BC to honor her memory. Today, we salute you, Dr. Elizabeth Bagshaw, for your courageous career in the medical field, bringing countless babies into this world, at the same time educating women about their right to make that choice in the first place, and then working till the age of 95 years young. You are a remarkable and true Canadian medical hero. Our next medical hero is a very important one indeed. Without his amazing discovery, many of you listening right now may have lived much different lives. Dr. Frederick Grant Banting was born in Alliston, Ontario on November 14, 1891. He was the youngest of 5 children and would attend medical school at the University of Toronto in September of 1912. He set up his practice in London, Ontario, and along with being a great doctor, he was also a very good painter. So good, in fact, he was known to have links to the Group of Seven, a famous group of Canadian painters from that era. On October 3, 1920, Dr. Banting would come up with an idea that would be considered one of the most important medical discoveries of the 20th century. He would discover the treatment for diabetes, insulin. With the help of others, he quickly began the production of insulin. In 1923, he would win the Nobel Prize for his work, making him the youngest to ever win the prize for medicine. Dr. Banting was the hero of the 1920s. He would go on to help develop the G-suit used by pilots to help prevent blackouts from the G-forces experienced in sudden maneuvers. Sadly, he would pass away in 1941 in a plane crash while leaving Newfoundland in bad weather to go test one of his new G-suits. Today, he is honored in countless ways for the many lives he has saved over the years. There are medals, speeches, a research foundation, numerous schools. There's even the Banting crater on the moon, named after this amazing doctor. The Flame of Hope was lit in 1989 by the Queen Mother as a tribute to Dr. Frederick Banting and all that have lost their lives to diabetes. The flame will remain lit until a cure is found. It is located at the Banting National Historic Site in London, Ontario, where Dr. Banting once lived. Along with the flame, a time capsule was buried in the same area in 1991 to honor the 100th anniversary of Dr. Frederick Banting's birthday. It will remain buried until a cure is found. Dr. Frederick Banting, you are a true treasure to the Canadian medical community and a hero to so many. I will forever remember you and your achievements every time I look at that big, beautiful moon. Just over a century ago, in 1918, the world was going through something pretty similar to what we're going through right now. The 1918 flu pandemic, right at the end of World War II. It had reached Vancouver Island. Dr. Arthur G. Price was the local public health officer at the time. He would set out what seemed to be strict guidelines, such as the ones we are seeing today. Restrictions on public gatherings like churches, schools, theaters, funerals, and sporting arenas. He was heavily criticized by the public for overreacting and was ignored by many. A local gathering was held by a fundraising group who had gathered a crowd of people together for the event. Dr. Price was so upset he scolded the crowd, stating those that attended were fools along with the people who held the event. He is quoted as saying, "Be serious and realize the undertakers are very busy." His biggest battle was Vancouver on the mainland, as they would remain open the whole time. The public became angry with all the strict rules, and the church was the first to start to protest. A parade was even held during the time when people were supposed to be what we know today as social distancing. This was due to the excitement of the men returning from the war. Dr. Price would repeat his advice over and over again, asking the community to remain vigilant to stay safe during these times. He would order a very strict regimen for disinfecting schools, churches, hotels, stores, and more before they could open their doors. The restrictions were lifted and placed again, lifted and then placed again, until they could finally be removed for good by Dr. Price in February 1920. 2 years later after it all began. In the end, Vancouver Island would fare quite well during the pandemic, coming out as one of the most successful to battle the flu, with only a 3.6% mortality rate as compared to Vancouver on the mainland that had stayed open and had a 10% mortality rate. Thanks to Dr. Arthur G. Price and the restrictions he applied during those tough times, his advice is credited with saving so many lives during the pandemic, though he does not often get the credit he deserves. Today we honor you, Dr. Arthur G. Price, for your knowledge and bravery during such a trying time in our history. You are a true Canadian medical hero. Fun fact, in the 1930s, Dr. Brown, Dr. Tisdale, and Dr. Drake would invent pablum during the Great Depression. Malnutrition was a major issue at the time, and the trio came up with the perfect solution at the Toronto Sick Kids Hospital. And now, our final medical hero on the adventure today, who is going to take us straight out of this world, Dr. Roberta Bondar. Born December 4, 1945 in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. As a child, she frequently conducted experiments in her basement lab that her father helped her build. Dr. Bondar would begin her career studying the nervous system. In 1983, she was selected to begin astronaut training. That's right, Dr. Bondar is literally going to the moon. On January 2, 1992, she would depart on a NASA mission as the first female astronaut in Canada and the first neurologist in the world to go to space. She would spend 8 days in space sitting 300 kilometers or 186 miles above her home planet in the world's first microgravity lab. Dr. Bondar was able to study how humans react to weightlessness and the effects of low gravity on the eyes and ear functioning. She would publish a book about her amazing experience in 1994 called Touching Earth. There is a school in Calgary named after her, along with multiple others across the country. She is the first astronaut to have a star on Canada's Walk of Fame. There is also the Roberta Bondar Park in her hometown in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. The Canadian Mint has released a coin, and there is an observatory named after her. Dr. Roberta Bondar, the first female astronaut in Canada and the world's first neurologist in space. It doesn't get much cooler than that. You are a true Canadian medical hero who is out of this world. Last fun fact for this medical adventure today, Dr. Henry J. Berlot, I hope I said that right, from Windsor, Ontario, was the first director of the new Hôtel Dieu's Poison Control Center. When he kept seeing kids being poisoned by medications or household products. Wanting to stop this tragic problem, he came up with those push-down child-proof bottles we all know today in 1967. Within 1 year of the bottles being made mandatory, child poisoning went down 90%. I hope you enjoyed this trip today as we looked back at some of the medical heroes of Canada. It is important that we remember them and their contributions to our medical community. They are the heroes of yesterday's diseases and ailments, changing outdated stereotypes, fighting against a pandemic, finding a treatment for one of the most common diseases on Earth, making life more manageable for so many, finding ways to save so many children from malnutrition and poisoning, even finding themselves on the moon. I'd say these medical heroes, just like the ones we see, know, and love today on the front lines, who are our friends, family members, shout out to my sister, and even more importantly, our community members, are all fighting for the same thing, for you to be happy, healthy, and safe. Overwhelming the medical community only takes them away from the people who need them most, and their time when they could be discovering something new that could just be the next big thing. I'm Canadian Girl. Until next time, my friends.